interested in doing monitoring, and whether or not it would be possible to have some kind of communication set up where if there was sort of work being proposed in an area, that some volunteers could set up some bat monitors rather than council having to pay for it. Yeah, that there might be some sort of ongoing arrangement that we could have.
Through the chair, definitely happy to have that conversation. Obviously, we take our guidance also from Regional Council and DOC. So working together, I think, will be the best outcome for the Peka Peka and what we can do in our community. So happy to touch base on that. Yeah.
Just to add to that, we've had monitoring undertaken on our farm and bat boxes installed, and to track the short tails. I think I know they have quite a population in Hamilton. They had no idea where they were heading to, and it seems they're even coming as far as our place, which is, and once they fill in all of those gaps, it's easier to understand the habits of it.
I've heard from Jerry Kessels, who's a local ecologist, and he said that the bats are actually right through the corridor between Pirongia and Mangatauturi. That's why I was quite keen to make sure that we do get adequate monitoring underway, so there's not much information known about them, and the more we can get to learn what they're doing, the better.
Mike.
Thank you, through the chair. Sally, just I just can't quite remember, in the LTP there around Kelly's Reserve, the water that we're topping up there, what's the remedy there, and in what year of the draft LTP is that remedy in play?
Very good question, and I think I'm a bit overwhelmed with LTP submissions I've been writing in the last wee while. If I can come back to you on that, Mike, is that all right? Yeah. Awesome. So if I just continue just with a couple of other highlights from the report. In terms of COVID-19 restrictions experienced during Q3, there does appear to be less tolerance by our library patrons to alert level 2 restrictions. While we do review restrictions at each occurrence that they occur, essentially at the forefront of my mind is the health and safety not only of our staff, is also of our patrons as well. So from that perspective, I think it's just that reminder that when we do go into alert level, there is a reason behind that for our community to adhere to as well. We've also received funding from the National Library Partnership, so this is additional funding to cover costs of computer use to provide free internet access to our communities. So that's to help with that digital literacy as well as job seekers, that sort of support. At the same time, we are having a few experiences with our computer software. So our software isn't dealing very well with upgrades in the applications. So we're just working with IT to try and resolve these issues, but we obviously still want to provide this service to our community. The museum LEOTC programs were impacted by the fluctuating COVID-19 alert level. We have adjusted our processes for school groups and treating them as a bubble during this period, so to try and help out a little bit with those schools at that time. And also the Formal Friday exhibition highlights the museum's extensive textile collection. So if you haven't seen this or had a chance to visit this, I would go and have a look. I'm one of those people that like to touch things. You're not allowed to touch them, but they are amazing skill sets, and the fabrics of the time is really great to look at. So I suggest you go and check that out. And that was a take that did come through COVID lockdown. Obviously, Hilary Barrett's Formal Fridays, and so that was where the exhibition itself came from, and we delved into the collections. Also, the Cambridge Parks team has been busy implementing the landscaping around the new pool, which you'll all get to see end of next week. The Parks team were also impacted by COVID-19, and that was really around a lot of the district's events being rescheduled throughout March. And I think that last weekend in March was significant for our communities and major events that were happening at the end of March. And so the team did, I think, a fantastic job to present our main streets for those events. In terms of burial numbers, we continue to track below 1920 figures. I think in my last report we were behind by 9, we're now behind by 20, so that trend is continuing. And I think just to highlight something that the reserve planning team has been quite busy on, and I know that you talk with other departments around, obviously the subdivision and land use consents that we're still getting, or still coming through the doors. The reserve planning team also have a component in that in providing feedback on any open space impacts that could happen. So that is keeping them busy just as well as it is keeping the consents team busy. So I'm happy to take any other questions.
Yeah, Roger.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, Sally, thank you for that. Going back to the tree maintenance contract, and on the page 3, where you mention some damage of fallen trees, there was damage done by a tree fall on the domain gates in Cambridge, and that seems to have gone unaddressed for quite a number of months now. Is there a challenge with getting that done?
I'll need to follow up on the team. I did actually see that recently when I was walking around there, and my question was exactly the same. So I know that the team, we're working on getting those up or fixed essentially. So I'll follow up and get a time frame for you on that. Yeah.
And in the next box, just including abandoned campsites. I just had a difficulty thinking about what an abandoned campsite was, or whether a recently vacated campsite might have been.
So we are currently experiencing some rough sleeping, if I can say that, as well as abandoned campsites would have been on during January. So that period is when people go to our lakeside reserves, set up a tent, and then essentially leave it after that New Year's Christmas period. So that's a cleanup. There is another item on your agenda today around the Freedom Camping submission. So we do actually, over that Christmas period, do have people camp in our parks when they shouldn't be camping in our parks, but they leave a lot of their debris behind it.
Unofficial parking
Yeah,
sites,
yeah,
where they've left a residual mess.
That's right. So yeah, on our lakeside reserves. But one thing that we are noting at the moment is some rough sleeping that we are following up with individuals with furniture, clothing, etc., being left in parks. So we're just following up with that at the moment as well.
Thank you.
Hazel, then Philip.
If I can through the chair, obviously take on board your comments. I would understand with Sherwin Village there'll be a level of service and a budget around that on what we can and can't do, but I will follow up on the team and see if there's any opportunities there.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I just wanted to thank you and your team, or you and Matt, the other week when we had an unusual burial case that we had to sort out over the weekend and things, and for that family, so appreciate that. It was quite unusual. It was unusual for me. I don't know if it's unusual for you, but it was for me anyway. So it was a good learning curve. Yeah, thank you.
No problems. I'll pass that on to the team. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you through you, Madam Chair. I'd just like to thank the Parks and Reserves very much for what they did for Anzac Day. Memorial Park looked absolutely pristine, and so did Anzac Green. It was excellent, and I think there's far too much accolade. You know, nobody gives you accolades. The one thing I'd just like to mention is that out of the blue, we always lay a wreath and go out to Kiki. We did notice that the tree there is actually impinging now onto the flagpole quite badly. And when you talk to Treescape, they sort of just brought that up. I tried to raise the flag, and actually the lanyard actually gets tangled up there. And also that just needs a little bit of a clean up, because we are proposing to have a service in Kiki now on Anzac Day on a regular basis. We've been asked by local residents to do so. So I just thought if I'd pass that on to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hazel. Any further questions for Sally? No? Excellent. So we have a recommendation there appearing on page 18 to accept or receive Sally's report. I'm happy to move from the chair. Elwyn second. All those in favour say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you, Sally. And yes, pass on our gratitude to your team. They did a great job in terms of keeping reserves, particularly around Anzac Day, intact. Lovely. Thank you. I think longitudinally we had quite a few people, because it was quite a lot more cost effective, shall I say, to bury in Waipa relative to other Waikato regional cemeteries. So we did have an uptick in terms of people outside the district being buried here. So some of that may have something to do with those people not coming. Less about our health, I would think. But thank you. Right, so that moves us on to the next item, which is the Waipa District Council submission on the Waikato Regional Council's draft. Good morning, David. How are you?
Good morning, Morena, Madam Chair, councillors, and your worship. This is an item on the agenda to do with asking for your sign-off of our submission on the Regional Council's long-term plan. Some of you were at the workshop on the 27th, will recall we discussed the need to put in a submission to the Regional Council draft long-term plan, and that took place on Fridays. And the only change in terms of what's written in the report to you is that it was in fact Gary Dyatt, the Chief Exec, who signed off that submission and not His Worship Mayor Jim. And one point Mayor Jim pointed out was that there's mention in there, specific mention of our long-term plan commitment to funding for the Peat Lakes, and there isn't mention or there's a possibility that it looks like we're overlooking the Maungatautari financial commitment. So he suggested I put in a note to the Regional Council just to say we will still be funding that. Yep. And so that's it. If there's any.
Does anybody, Liz, you look like you have a question.
Yeah. I was just wanted to raise Te Kutu as well, just in terms of any future. I just know the Regional Council's reconnected with the River Authority, but just maybe an ongoing reminder about that project.
Thank you.
Makes sense, yes. Any other question? Andrew? You're happy to move the recommendation appearing on page 32. Do I have a seconder? Claire? All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Carried.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks. Thank you, David. So that moves us on to our next report, which is the quarterly district growth report. Tony and Kirsty, welcome. Take the hot seat.
Maria in Rangatira. Good morning, councillors and Mayor. We're doing a double act this morning. So I'll hand over to my better looking colleague to start with.
Kia ora koutou. So just start on the basis that the report is taken as read. Just highlight a couple of other issues to bring to your attention. With regard to the proposed national policy statement on urban development, we've provided updates to you in terms of the population projections and work on that, noting previously that there has been delayed due to delays with the release of census data from Stats New Zealand, but we're getting very close to being able to have something to share with you, and proposing that we will do that in an informal workshop followed by a formal meeting of elected members. With regard to what's happening...
May I just ask a question on that? Thank you for that, and it's good that we're getting that. Will we have that information, do you think, before we go into the LTP submission period?
Unlikely to have that prior to the hearing of submissions and deliberations, which, as you're aware, Councillor Gordon is scheduled for next week. So that is still being progressed, and we haven't been provided with that final updated data.
That's a shame that we're not going to have that before we get into those deliberations.
Just at a local level, in relation to...
David.
Sorry to interrupt. Just on the population, I've scheduled in a workshop on the 25th with elected members to give you a run through with the population. And if we've got an update by then, I can share that.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, through the chair. So just at a local level, with regard to the Nahanapori Village Concept Plan, you'll be aware that we engaged with the community earlier this year, had quite good engagement and feedback, overwhelmingly positive, and I think that that really speaks to the work that had been undertaken prior to that engagement phase. So we'll be looking at coming back to you in August. The reason for the delay is just to have regard to the LTP timing requirements. And also would just like to highlight in respect of the Kihiki Urban Development Plan, so there is a workshop later today on that. We attended a rather robust community meeting in Kihikihi as part of the long-term plan engagement, and the feedback from the community was that they would like to look at that plan and have input into it. So the recommendation for elected members is that we do engage with the community again. So we'll be looking to do that in June and July. But as I mentioned, that will be the subject of a further workshop and looking at coming back to this committee in June. Thank you. That's all from me.
Thanks, Kirsty. So I'm picking up at, I'm looking at page 3 of the actual report rather than the agenda. So C123, there's lots of activity there. If you've driven past there, you'll see a lot of earthworks. That's all part of their consent. So C1, 2 and 3, a lot of it hinges around the 3Ms application, which is currently in with council. So that's a subdivision application which has been progressed. There's hearings end of May on that. The reason it hinges around there is because that's central to a lot of the infrastructure that C3 in particular will feed off, but also C1 feeds into. So a lot of it is central to the decision that comes out of that application. Growth cells and housing, we just reported there that we're looking at doing some smarter and more frequent, I guess, monitoring around that. I know it's of particular interest, but we also need to get a better handle on our level of uptake in the growth cells. So the intention is to report back at the next quarterly report and start giving you some metrics back at least quarterly on that level of uptake around the growth cells. Next section is around district plan development. So Joe does have a report later on. But if there's any particular questions now that you'd like to raise, happy to take any on this particular item.
Madam Chair, I've got a question, as you know, about the Waikoha station
Yes.
and the process to determine notification. Like, that's an issue to do with unauthorised removal of native biodiversity. And it's been I suppose a few years ago now, so I'm quite keen to understand why it's taken so long to make a notification decision.
Yeah, so thank you, Claire. For those who aren't up to speed on that, so it is some years ago now. There was a significant natural area in Waikaha Station. It was unlawfully cleared, and we met with DOC incidentally yesterday, actually, and they were asking the same thing. It was unlawfully cleared. It's multi-jurisdictional, so the Waikato Regional Council has some controls over it, but most of those controls land on us because it's a land use activity. And so we had no indication that anything was happening there until after it had been cleared and someone made us aware of it. So we're requiring a retrospect. There was a bit of an enforcement follow-up, and any further works was ceased on it, although it was a bit late at that stage. So it is about 3 years in the making. We required a resource consent of them, a retrospective resource consent, otherwise enforcement action was going to be taken. They have lodged a resource consent. It took a long time coming. So that's been lodged. We have outsourced that to consultants now. Our consultant ecologist has gone back and sought some clarification of their application because there was a couple of points that we didn't feel were quite well covered. So we've asked for that. So the next stage is once that information's come in, then there'll be a formal Section 92 request for information. That information comes back. If we need to get any more information, that information then comes back in. Then we look at making a notification decision. So it's still a few weeks away yet from making that decision. We're quite aware there's a bit of public interest in it. It is something that was, it's a significant area of significant natural area. So it's a significant SNA, which has been clearfilled. So there is a loss of biodiversity. It's quite real. So we just got to go through the process and make sure that we follow the right process we go through.
To get that, so Waipara District Council is the lead agency handling it, because I mean that's what I've been told in the past, that there was uncertainty as to whether it should be a regional council issue or Waipara District. Yeah, so it looks like we're doing it. Yeah,
that's correct, because principally it related to clear filling of SNAs, which is a land use activity, which is controlled now district land. Yep. So we're up to, so on page 6 of the report itself, we did actually miss out this in this report some metrics around consents. So I'm not quite sure what happened there, but normally you'd see the consents. We've got the consents numbers, but they'd normally be just how we're tracking in terms of timeframes. So the numbers are up from this time last year. Limbs are down slightly, but consents haven't eased up, and there's more coming through the door. The timeframes, so if you recall, we did have an extension to timeframes that was going out just to manage the workload. That's now come off, so we're doing it case by case, and all of them are within the statutory timeframes. Where are we? I'm happy to take questions on the next couple of pages, Madam Chair.
Does anybody have any questions for either Tony or Kirsty?
Okay.
Busy period, obviously.
Thank you. So building compliance, again, we've got Carl in the room, so happy to take any questions. I guess the key story there again is all those consents this year are up on not only last year, but the year before. So there is a positive increasing trend, which is good from a growth perspective, but growth comes with growing pains. So we're trying to manage that.
I think those figures in terms of the consents buildings going ahead is tremendous. Is this putting any pressure on our inspection staff to get, site inspections through on a timely basis?
I'm going to see if Carl can answer that one. Thanks.
Processing times was still sort of within the statutory timeframes, something that we worked very highly in the past, and sort of scraping to do it the current workload. But we're going to look now at how that affects on our staff as well.
All right. Yep. Opinion now, do you think that this increase is likely to continue over the next few months? Are we getting signs that it is going to continue?
From my perspective, that's what we're seeing. So we know there's new greenfield growth cells. So we've got T12, C2. There's a number of them that are coming on stream, T8, T11. We anticipated this. They're probably coming on stream a little bit faster than what Waipa 2050 anticipated, just because of the COVID response and the need for housing and everything that goes with it. So we are anticipating probably actually an increase in the number of building and land use consents and subdivision consents coming through. Who knows when that will peak? So we've got a number of greenfields growth cells that still haven't come on stream yet. C4, there's another one in there too. So it might be 2 or 3 years yet before we see a bit of an ease off of that. So the next section, we've got 3 sections in there. Carl's here if you want any questions around that. So monitoring, enforcement, animal control, and also environmental health. Just one trend I noted on complaints. So the complaints are all up on the last year's, except for parking. So I guess what I read into that is that there's been some positive responses to having looking at the parking a bit harder than what we have been.
I think it's been fantastic for a district having the parking enforcement being done, and it has made a improvement.
Thank you. Yeah, there's massive improvement in Cambridge, and it's helped too by 2 businesses closing where the owners of those 2 businesses repeatedly parked outside their shops every day, so they've sold and gone, haven't seen them on the streets. So that helped. But it certainly has helped with the extra officers. So.
Mike.
Yeah, through the chair. Hey, just a thank you to the team around the rubbish, the sort of not fly tipping so much, but those illegal rubbish sites that are being dealt with. And I see the next ones are Mangakawa and Hydro Road. So yeah, I think it's good that we're giving sort of people, signage and some mail drops and that sort of thing, giving them every chance to get it right. And it looks like it's worked in the rest of the district. So yeah, well done on that.
Through you, Madam Chair, if I can just provide one further point in response to the query that Councillor Gordon had earlier in relation to population. Whilst we won't have that updated data to inform the hearings of submissions and deliberations next week, that information will be shared with you in advance of the LTP coming back to this committee in mid-June. At the point that you make a recommendation to Council for the end of June. So just wanted to provide that clarification. Thank you.
Great, good point to make. Any other questions for these 2? Obviously very busy people. No? Anything else you wanted to address in it? Roger.
Point of clarification. Going to your Appendix 1, and it's just, I could have asked you this outside of the meeting, but Waipa District growth cells, you've got all the growth cells around. What's the red highlighted dotted line? There's no key, and I'm just wondering what that
current
represents.
town boundary, isn't it?
Is that the urban boundary?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that shows that all of those developments are definitely outside the urban boundary. Yeah.
That's correct. They're outside the current urban boundary, but Waipa 2050 anticipated. So these are greenfields. So that urban boundary needs to be extended out around those. So there's a correction that needs to be made.
When would we address that?
The spatial plan, the community plan is probably the place to do that.
Sorry?
The community plan. So there's an item in later on public excluded around that. So that's probably the place to address that.
Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So we have a recommendation there on page 40 to receive your report. Mike, happy to move. Do I have a seconder? Claire? All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thank you so much, and thank you for all your hard work. Yes, I'm trying really hard to keep up with this. So that moves us on to our next item, item 9 on our agenda, the Civil Defence Emergency Management Quarterly Report with David Symes. Good morning, David.
So, yeah, quarterly report is divided into 3 sections: national overview, regional, and also local through a shared service arrangement. Just touch on some key points under each of the headings. So first, the national overview. I guess notably on the 5th of March, there were, 3 significant earthquakes fell across the country, which prompted a response through our local civil defence groups as well, mainly on the East Coast, but certainly for us on the West Coast as well as part of our shared service agreement. So that was the 7.3 at East Cape, followed by a 7.4 earthquake, and then an 8.1 earthquake in the Killing Islands. Probably notably around that was the ability through their, increased technology through the data point network that would greatly assist the tsunamis with forecasting uncertainties, and in particular enabled a much quicker cancellation of the threat from the 8.1 Killing earthquake. So not only does it generate the alert, but obviously the ability to stand down and the people return to their homes. Moving through the report and just noting the on page 3, the 1.4 million for civil defence training fund has been approved. The Tertiary Education Commission. So effectively that means all of our training for our council staff or experienced people is free. It's at no cost, so we can qualify trainers through that, and especially outside of our local council staff. It enables welfare training as well for our welfare centre and our volunteers as well, at no cost to those people or to council. Moving through the regional overview, the joint committee, obviously Councillor Brown attended this, but towards the bottom there, refers to COVID-19 resurgence planning, where formal representations were made to central government to ensure local and regional input was received, including was included when setting regional border locations. So that was followed through when Ellen and myself attended the meeting last Friday with DP and MC and health and other government agencies around that. And it's mainly centred around, I guess up to now, it's been potentially regional lockdowns. If there was an outbreak in the community again, but it focused a lot around IQ, facilities and staff working at those if there was an outbreak as to a more localised lockdown, and that's certainly the feedback from the group. Also, I guess around those rural remote areas, and that I went through those areas is actually if there was lockdown, how did it affect those people who are trying to access hospital or working in and out of the city. So lots of feedback. It was positive, and ultimately I guess it's DPMC and health that are going to make those decisions where those border controls go in, but it's great to have that opportunity to provide that feedback. On top of page 4, just again, Hardy old end around the civil defence signs on school premises. Ministry of Education will be contacted in relation to those signages. This has been going for some years, and most of those signs through our area on schools have actually been removed. There are a few in rural remote areas, but for pragmatic reasons they remain because it's the obvious place where people would assemble if there was an emergency. But very few of those within our shared service arrangement locally. So there's reference there around our alternative EOC at Kiki. So that's progressed well. So that's, I guess, resourcing that. We're down to the last, I guess, a few things for IT equipment. If we were required to set up an EOC at a smaller scale, it means that we would have to occupy council chambers here. And we've used that to sort of monitoring most of the elements we could manage from there with this staff. Also, I guess, moving through our readiness section under training. So this quarter has been a slightly quieter quarter for us around training, mainly because of this pressure on local council staff around long-term plans and I guess other things. So we modified our training around that, but to this point, we still push through some training in February around foundation training and startup stores. Intermediate training to date is 50 staff being trained through sort of training at a variety of levels. And I guess in the last quarter, we also have further training and exercises scheduled. In regards to response, touched on the already on the tsunami threats and I guess our involvement with coastal areas. And close what's the report just with recovery. We see here so through the chair, anything you want to comment around recovery. I guess it's a COVID-19 reference there. I think that was working covered off.
Nothing further to add. I think you're all pretty fairly kept up to date with very regular reporting, and the community advisors will come and report to you to the next SPMP with some of their activities that they're getting on with.
Just to close off, our community engagement continues to be a focus, right, and being events.
David, oh, sorry, Madam Chair.
No, where you go.
The Dark Buoy Network, have you got any more info on that? I've seen buoys out in the ocean, but I'm not too sure what they were. I didn't thought maybe you might know.
Only what I've read is that they actually
Just like to congratulate you, David. It was an excellent report. Well done. And I'd just like to actually, in saying that, move that we accept your report. Well done. I don't have any comment other than that. Well done.
And I'd be happy to second it. But the thing that I was just watching the talk about the fault line down that's coming now identified up through the South Island. Have we got anything similar to that that we need to be looking at and preparing up this way, or could that earthquake actually do much damage to the North Island?
I think the modelling does show that we would be affected by it. I think probably the alarming thing about that is I think it was predicted over 75% that would occur within 50 years. So that was a high threshold, that I've actually predicted there. So, it's going to happen. Probably for us around, I think it's Mount Taranaki, around something happening there in terms of their predictions, and again the likelihood that it would affect us potentially through earthquake or ash fallout, waterways, those sorts of things.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Hazel. Were there any other questions or comments for David? No? Fantastic. So we've got a mover and a seconder. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Great. Thanks very much. So that moves us to our next item, which is appearing on about page 120 odd. Which is a submission. Submission of proposed changes to freedom camping legislation. Welcome, Graham.
Right. Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everybody. Hopefully a quick item to get through. The Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment's proposing changes to the rules around freedom camping to make it more sustainable and reduce costs to ratepayers for enforcement and any cleanups. Waipa does not generally have a freedom camping problem. Our issues are generally restricted to a few lakeside reserves over Christmas and New Year. But we've drafted this submission to MB to support the proposals. We think they're likely to make it easier for councils to manage camping. We certainly don't want them to make it harder for us in the future, especially if the volume of camping in Waipa does increase at any stage. The closing date is the 16th of May. So we're asking today for your feedback, any suggested amendments, and the delegation to the Chief Executive to make any more minor adjustments before we submit our response to MB. Thank you.
Oh, crikey, wrong one.
Yeah, thanks, Rim. My perception, and certainly going around on the rural tour on Saturday, there were comments about, we're starting to see an increase in freedom camping, particularly with a large number of New Zealanders that are actually buying these cheap camper vans coming up. What do you, if this goes through, what kind of impact will that have us on the cost of enforcement?
Might need to refer to Sally here. Her team's more the experts on this. I'm just the writer. Yeah.
That's right. If I can, through the chair, currently we do not do any enforcement in terms of our lakeside reserves. Prior to Christmas of 2019-2020, we went through and installed signage which identified areas where people could camp within our lakeside reserves. And we do find that we have had fairly good abidance to those areas and sharing of those reserves, which are busy over summer period. One of our key areas, and I know that Liz has had quite a bit of involvement with this, is around Hurahura Domain at Pairere, and that is very close and identified on websites, being very close to Hobbiton. But obviously the change that we've had with COVID, we haven't had that same impact. So in terms of enforcement, we will only enforce if we are receiving complaints. Our contractors do check what is happening out within those areas, but we do not currently have resources for daily or weekly enforcement.
You're correct. It was on the Hurahura Domain that we actually had the feedback on the rural tour. So it is an increasing challenge. Yeah. So it's, from what you're saying, if we don't do it now and we're required to do it in the future, it would be an additional cost to us for enforcement.
So I think also if we look at the submission itself and what MBA are asking for, essentially all of those sites also have public facilities. So I think, we might all see in our travels that there are a sticker that says self-contained that can be on a variety of vehicles. Whether or not that's 100% true, is it just a sticker that you've got? I'm not quite sure. But, from this perspective, I think within Waipa, we are quite lucky that those reserves do have public facilities. However, it seems to be that I am attracted to these things. Unfortunately, I have been on some of our reserves where toilet facilities haven't been used when they should have been. So it does occur, unfortunately.
It does, and you're right. I could probably make a sticker at home and pop it on my vehicle. Not that I've got a vehicle. Yeah.
Claire.
Thanks. So my comments about the unintended consequences of the changes, which I do think are really good, actually. Yeah, it looks like they're really sensible approaches. But the MB document that supports this mentions possible impacts for homeless people, vulnerable people. And I think that we really need to highlight in our submission that it's not acceptable that if these changes, cause problems for homeless people. There are, I'm looking at the MB document, and I think what's on page 158 of our agenda, I think it's page 28 of their report, page 28. It talks about homelessness and makes some suggestions about a referral system or something, so that if we become aware of homeless people, yeah, looks like they're freedom campers and another guys, yeah, that we actually make sure that they're referred to the appropriate agencies or something. Yeah.
That was going to be my comment too, on the differentiate between the homelessness, and that makes me think that that's why the numbers are probably increasing, because there's more and more people now, and even in our lovely Waipa district, who are taking to living in there, having to, no other choice but to live that way.
Liz. Thanks, Susan. So certainly support the fixed toilet approach, but I just wanted to make mention that I guess we've put a lot of effort into working with Sally over the years into Hora Domain in particular. Freedom camping was an issue. It's far better managed because we're very lucky we've got some wardens down there. So the neighbours are looking after, they're essentially doing our enforcement job for us. And I hear from them very regularly. So we're very, very lucky. And I think that's our community approach and community spirit that we see. But we can't take that for granted either going forward. So while we have them, it's really great to nurture them. And I guess, yeah, I'm always really respectful of the work that they do in this particular space. So certainly support the fixed toilet approach, but also just keeping the signage. Yeah, Hora's got good signage now. It took us a little while to get there, but the other reserves, I'm also concerned that those other toilets aren't really up to a great standard. So when we look at tourism, you know, they are the old toilet block. They've had issues, they're very, very old. And at some point or another, I'd like to see upgrades to those facilities, particular Keeley's, yeah, all along that lakeside, I think. It's probably coming up time. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes, Roger. Yeah. Just to remind everybody to turn their microphones on. Yeah. I understand people are having difficulty hearing us online.
What Liz has said is very, very true. And, you know, the government have got actually a tourism fund that you can apply to put in additional toilet facilities. When we went on the rural tour, and this is not with freedom camping, but it is with the style of tourism that's coming through, and that's the cycling tourism. And we have a number of very strong cycling tourism routes within the area of Cambridge, and whether or not the installation of some toilet facilities around those loops would actually be a good idea, and that application for some of those through the Tourism Infrastructure Fund would be at all possible.
So this is one business case I can remember from the LTP, is just around new public convenience facilities. So I think we only have 2 identified within the long-term plan, but obviously recognising that when the Tourism Infrastructure Fund does become available, we can apply for funding with that. There has also previously been funding through MB around like summer wardens, which I know other councils have been successful at for this type of enforcement checking ranger type of service. So that is something that the team would like to look at that going forward. But we don't specifically within the LTP have funding identified for more toilets as such.
Lou.
Yeah, further to what Councillor Gordon just said, I have a problem here that it's fine to have them actually self-contained. We have to have the ability to actually empty them as well. And, you know, the facility, but it becomes very, very important, particularly in our local area. We're talking of having a new dump station, but we do need to have that facility. And I do completely agree with Councillor Stolwick that we make sure that they are fixed toilets, not compostable toilets that are sat outside, or a toilet that is actually attached and brought outside into the foyer of the area. I've seen all these things operate. So I honestly feel that we can actually enforce this, but we do need to have the other side of it where there is enough facilities for them to actually release their tanks.
Philip, then Hazel.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, Little Waipa Reserve, which is in south of Waikato, it's not ours, but that's a really great example of a new toilet facility there. That's a very popular campground, and right on the Waikato River Trail, which is also part of the tour of Aotearoa route as well. So that's a really good example there of a fixed toilet and easy to clean. I suppose you can water blast it easy enough because it's corrugated iron and things like that too. So, yeah.
Quickly say, do you have a relationship with the Caravan Association? Because generally they will remind all of their members about the issues that are being discussed here today. And I'm pleased to say that most of them adhere to that because that's part of their membership of the Caravan Association.
Yes, we do, and we have worked with them and also identified the changes in terms of the signage we implemented at our lakeside reserves. So yes.
Jim.
Madam Chair, I think some of the comments I'm going to make have been touched on already, but at the end of the day, although we're not doing too much enforcement at the moment, I think we've got to be prepared that that's going to be necessary. So in terms of looking at possible funding, and I suppose it's all very well having freedom camping, but we don't want to limit the use of reserves that are paid for by ratepayers because of the volume of freedom campers and actually taking over the reserves and not even leaving sufficient space for locals. So at some point we're going to have to limit the numbers, even if it's not the behaviour of them, it's just sheer volume of them. Effectively pushing out locals from using the reserves, and let's face it, the reserves are funded by the ratepayers, so it's all very well subsidising other people's holidays, but we do need to be mindful that our locals need to be able to get to those reserves as well.
If I can, through the chair, that was one of the things that we did work with, and there's an app called Campermate, and there's also a camera did go in at Hara Domain to try and help with that, the numbers that were on site there, because I think that was previously one of our reserves that very much got impacted by campers first in, first served on the waterfront views, and therefore blocking that day use. So that's something that we've been working with those apps to try and help minimise.
That's good. It's a real balancing act, really, isn't it? Okay.
Well, it all sounds a bit bad for freedom campers. We have to remember how much money they actually spend in the area as well, and that during the COVID, there was quite a few of them about, and they had to buy food, they had to buy soap to wash themselves, and so they still spent quite a considerable amount of money supporting our area as well.
Okay.
Sorry.
Final comment, Philip.
Very brief. We are right on the boundary, particularly Hora there, right on the boundary of three of the biggest attractions in the country with Waitoma Caves, Hobbiton and Rotorua. So we're lucky we've got so many people coming through our area. And coming down Hora Road last night, coming back home, I looked over to, I think it was Alan Eason's block, and that was just packed with camper vans. I didn't actually look at the reserve in front, our reserve, but his place anyway was packed with camper vans.
Okay, so just getting back to our agenda here, on page 122, we have a recommendation there. Does anybody have any you're happy to move, Mike? Do I have anybody who's happy to second that? Lou? Fantastic. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Great. Thank you so much for your work. So that brings us then to a resolution to exclude the public for our short section and public excluded. So that you're happy to move, Philip. Seconded, Andrew. All those in favour say aye. Against?